To KCPL's Central Library Hellsberg Auditorium. I'm Katie Stover, and if I look familiar, then it's because you've seen me at every big read event the library has hosted in celebration of An American Sunrise by Joy Harjo. And I am so proud of this big read. It's our 7th big read. It's the first time we've featured a collection of poetry. It's also the first time we've featured an author of color. And we were also fortunate enough to host 3-term U.S. Poet Laureate Joy Harjo a couple of weeks ago. If you missed that event, please be sure to watch it on the library's YouTube channel. The live stream recording won't be available after May 31st, and it is something special to view. We have many generous partners to thank for making Joy Harjo's visit and other events possible. Of course, there's the National Endowment for the Arts and Arts Midwest, both of the managers of the Big Read program. And on the local front, KCPL is grateful to Travoy, the Ewing Marion Kaufman Foundation, the Francis Family Foundation, and the Maria Rosa Menachau Lecture Series. All the work that has gone into planning and executing this big read would not be possible without the guidance and graciousness of our presenting partners, the Kansas City Indian Center and Haskell Indian Nations University. Gayleen Krauser, Carrie Cornelius, and Cindy Hole have been instrumental in the shaping of this big read. Wapita Tanka, a phrase that Cindy taught me. Many thanks to this powerful triumvirate of Indigenous women for sharing their time and wisdom with their community. Tonight's special guest furthers our understanding of the place Indigenous people hold in the arts. Joanna Hearne is an associate professor at the University of Oklahoma, and we were lucky enough to have Dr. Hearne for more than 15 years at the University of Missouri-Columbia, where she founded the Digital Storytelling Program. Dr. Hearne focuses on Native American and global Indigenous film and media studies. She's written 2 books on the subject, Native Recognition, Indigenous Cinema and the Western, and Smoke Signals, Native Cinema Rising. I found Smoke Signals to be a fascinating resource for viewing our own Big Read film series through an Indigenous lens. Dr. Hearne contributed greatly to the selection of the films that the library is screening. And my favorite comment from film attendees is, I would never have watched that movie if the library didn't screen it. We can't really appreciate a film without opening our eyes, and Dr. Joanna Hearne is here this evening to help us open them further with her talk on Indigenous Cinema Now, Native American and First Nation filmmaking in the 21st century. Please welcome Dr. Joanna Hearne.
Thank you, Kate, so much for that nice introduction. It's very, very kind. Good evening. Thank you for being here today. Is my sound okay? Yep. Yeah? Okay. I want to begin by honoring the Missouri, Oto, Kansa, Osage, Shawnee, Delaware, and other Indigenous nations here at the juncture, near the juncture of the Missouri and Kansas rivers, as the first peoples of this place. We are all in relationship with these nations and with these lands and waters that are and their ancestral territories, and we can act on that relationship by supporting Indigenous projects, as we are doing here, by attending to Indigenous voices and stories. I'd also like to thank Kate and the whole KC Library staff for organizing this terrific series, inviting me to speak. I'm honored to be here. Shout out to friends in the audience, my former student Lindsay Fote in the back. Thank you so much. Thanks for all of you also who are tuning in remotely. One more thing about this lecture is that I will spoil a few movies. If you haven't seen them, it is my work to spoil movies as a film professor, and so you may find yourself learning some things that happen in movies as we speak about them, even if you haven't seen them, so a heads up. So I want to start this visual tour of Indigenous films and filmmakers with an iconic moment from an iconic film. This is from the 1998 film Smoke Signals, and it is a moment from the middle of the film. So here it is. Sound up. One more time. Oh, one more time, that's right.
You know, the only thing more pathetic than Indians on TV is Indians watching Indians on TV.
So, really brief moment. The film's author and screenwriter Sherman Alexie didn't write that line, by the way. That was actor Evan Adams who improvised what would become like one of the film's signature lines. And this joke circulated in reviews of the film when it came out as a sign of the film's break from Hollywood's representations of Indians as 19th century stoic warriors. Promoted as the first film written, directed, and acted by Native American filmmakers to gain wide release, Smoke Signals was immediately recognized critically as signifying a paradigmatic shift in Native American film history. Indians watching Indians on TV is a profoundly self-reflexive line. It refers both to the Indian characters in the Western on the television in the film, and also to the characters in Smoke Signals watching the film, and also privately addresses the film's Indigenous audience, pointing to the Indigenous viewers off screen. This film is for you, it says. The context of viewing is important too. Westerns, a genre organized around the ideology of manifest destiny and killing Indian characters, a genre with the explicit purpose of erasing Indian families from the land, are here screened in a Native family home that exemplifies the very Indigenous future that that genre refuses to envision. So Smoke Signals shows us that Native people are not vanished in the past, they're still here watching TV. How much more contemporary can you get? This is Smoke Signals' intervention, right? Just before the millennium, no more Dances with Wolves, no more Last of the Mohicans, no more leathers and feathers roles. Instead, Native actors can play contemporary roles where they play basketball and watch TV. So here is someone watching TV. In Smoke Signals, this is Victor Joseph as a young child, played by Cody Lightning, Cree actor. Yet later in the film, we see a counterpoint to this light, joking tone when young Victor Joseph sees his mother and father fighting in front of the family television, which is, of course, playing a Western. Indians watching Indians on TV becomes part of Victor's household environment as he is presented with both televised and family forms of psychological trauma at once. He sees domestic conflict and the television screen simultaneously. And for this young Native viewer, making meaning from pop culture movies broadcast into his home, the Western genre images come to stand for the effects of colonization on his own psyche, while his parents' domestic dispute takes on the magnitude of genocide and war and dispossession, right? That's part of the Western. There's the element of pathos in Indians watching Indians on TV. Because Thomas Builds the Fire was right. The primary problem Indigenous peoples have faced in public culture is misrepresentation. Those images of Indians in Westerns are pathetic, a combination of invisibility through omission and other forms of erasure and hyper-visible falsehoods. This is Rock Hudson from an Anthony Mann film from 1950 called Winchester 73. And you can see that, he's a non-native actor, he's a white star, in a wig, in paint. And then what you can also see in the next slide is that he has a prosthetic nose, right? And he's a fake nose, and you can see this big hooked nose that's backlit, and so it's being exaggerated. So he's also racialized in a kind of exaggerated stereotype. So this is Rock Hudson red-facing sort of very stereotypical figure from a typical mid-century Western. More Westerns were produced in the 20th century than any other kind of film, shaping the way generations of Americans imagined Indians. Hollywood Westerns taught the viewing public what Indians should look like, for example, through an array of devices like bronze skin paint and prosthetic noses and wigs and costumes. Other stereotypes include one, that Indigenous people were violent intruders. Westerns actually reversed the history of settlement in order to represent Indigenous peoples as invaders on their own land. 2, that Indigenous people were violent and primitive and always outside of the flow of contemporary life. And 3, in many ways, the worst one, that Indigenous people were gone, a vanishing or already vanished population visible only in the historical past. Because settler colonialism is not a singular event, but rather an ongoing structure, these misrepresentations are ongoing. And they are repeated again and again in many different ways when other people control the camera and Indigenous people are shut out of telling their own stories. These hypervisible misrepresentations and omissions also translate all too easily into political invisibility, as we saw in just one example in the CNN coverage or miscoverage of the 2020 election. The erasure of the Native American vote, which was critical in Arizona, did not escape the of Indigenous viewers, see if there's something else, who promptly turned to internet memes using stills from smoke signals to mock CNN's sloppy reporting. This talk on Native Americans in film could focus entirely on stereotypes, everything from wise Indian sages to sports mascots, and it's important to turn a critical eye on stereotypes, to prove them inaccurate and call them out. But when we analyze misrepresentations of Native people, it's not enough to demand accurate representation, because calling for strict accuracy in all artistic representation doesn't leave room for aesthetic stylization, experimentation, genre films, the arts of the imagination. Instead, with film scholars Ella Shohat and Robert Stam, we can ask about the larger politics and social relations of the film's message, as well as content, across the whole circuit of film production and reception. They call this questions of address. Who is speaking? Who is listening? When and how have Indigenous peoples gotten access to media production? When Indigenous people control the camera and tell their own stories on screen, what do they say? One goal of my work is to make visible the centrality of Indigenous images to film and media history by studying films themselves and by recovering the stories of Indigenous performers, filmmakers, artists, and intellectuals in film history. And even though this talk is about films from the millennium forward, and we're going to get to those, one thing I want to make clear is that Indigenous filmmaking began much earlier than most people realize. So let me just show just a few slides of some of these lesser-known filmmakers. Here's Edwin Carew, the stage name for Jay Fox, and his brothers Finus Fox and Wallace Fox, who were citizens of the Chickasaw Nation, and they were among the earliest American filmmakers known to have Indigenous heritage. Together, the Fox brothers represent 4 decades of continuous Chickasaw presence from 1914 to 1954, at the height of the studio era in American cinema, the same period of time where you saw the Rock Hudson slide, right, 1950. Their story reveals that Indigenous participation in the film industry was not confined to named performers, uncredited extras, and cultural consultants, but rather included people working at all levels of production. And this participation did not begin with smoke signals in 1998, but rather at the very origins of American cinema. These are stories that have not been told before about Indigenous Hollywood. And this genealogy of Indigenous filmmaking corrects exclusions of Indigenous peoples from Hollywood history, as well as their misrepresentation on screen. Okay, so that was the pre-credit sequence of my talk. And now we're going to dive in. Consistent themes in Indigenous filmmaking foreground Indigenous presence, not absence. Indeed, like many productions, like the documentary film Rumble, The Indians Who Rocked the World, recover hidden histories, both histories of Indigenous participation, like Rumble's many stories of Indigenous influences in rock history, and also histories of trauma, family separation, and residential schooling. We see films exploring intergenerational relationships that narrate both onslaughts of colonization and the resilience of Indigenous peoples to heal and rebuild strong communities. We see Indigenous appropriation of mainstream Hollywood film genres and forms, such as road movies, horror and zombie films, documentaries, animation, and science fiction, to convey intergenerational trauma as well as Indigenous survivance and resilience. So 2 key frameworks I want to offer today for understanding film from this month's series include 1, visual sovereignty, and 2, Indigenous futurisms. So the first, visual sovereignty, is based in Indigenous political sovereignty. This is important because when we are talking about Indigenous identity, we're not actually talking about race. While heritage is important, Indigenous identity is not fully a racial identity, it is a political identity. It is citizenship in an Indigenous nation whose self-governing sovereignty is acknowledged in the nation-to-nation agreements with the United States that we call treaties, the foundation for all of federal Indian law. Native sovereignty is the recognition, even within US jurisprudence, of Native nations as separate and sovereign political entities, as nations that predate the colonizing nation of the United States. I think I want to stay on that. Tuscarora artist Jolene Rickert extends the idea of sovereignty to talk about Indigenous experience in the arts when she writes that sovereignty is the border that shifts Indigenous experience from a victimized stance to a strategic one. Seneca scholar Michelle Raheja describes visual sovereignty as a reading practice for thinking about the space between resistance and compliance, wherein Indigenous filmmakers and actors revisit, contribute to, borrow from, critique, and reconfigure film conventions, at the same time operating within and stretching the boundaries created by those conventions. Scholar Kristen Dowell writes, I define visual sovereignty as the articulation of Aboriginal peoples' distinctive cultural traditions, political status, and collective identities through aesthetic and cinematic means. I locate Aboriginal visual sovereignty also in the act of production. The off-screen production itself is crucial for understanding media production as an act of sovereignty. So it's moving political sovereignty and that political concept into a space where it becomes a framework for understanding Indigenous arts, the audiovisual arts. To illustrate visual sovereignty at work in films like Smoke Signals, I want to show some clips of Indigenous activists speaking about their land, connecting and reconnecting with homelands or indigenizing new spaces such as cities, while reflecting on the power of activist voices both off-screen and on-screen. So these characters are played by different Native actors, but both actors in the clips I'll show are political leaders and community activists themselves who have influenced American Indian activism starting as early as the 1970s. So the casting here is really important, and that's that process of production. So Smoke Signals, I think most of you have seen it, but if you haven't, Smoke Signals is a road movie. Like two Coeur d'Alene young men, Victor and Thomas, travel to Arizona to retrieve Victor's father's ashes, and their journey is filled with memories and moments of storytelling about Victor's father. As I suggested earlier, the film's profound intervention in cinematic images of Indians in 1998 was to locate Indigenous people both on and off screen. So the familiar conventions of the road movie, the buddy movie, and the comedy form a kind of cultural currency or a common ground, like a way for all the audiences to sit at the same table. The film announces itself as a form of Indigenous media in the opening shots that link the reservation landscape with the voice and then the images of the K-Res radio headquarters, this sort of weathered trailer home, and its MC, Randy Pion, played by John Trudell, Santee Sioux, a prominent activist. So here is the clip.
Good morning, this is Randy Pion on K-Res Radio. That's KREZ Radio, the voice of the Coeur d'Alene Indian Reservation. And Coeur d'Alene people, our reservation is beautiful this morning. It's a good day to be Indigenous. It's 45 degrees in the sun. It's 8 a.m. Indian time in 1998.
And it's time for the morning traffic report. For that, let's go to Lester Falls Apart at the K-Res traffic ban, broken down at the crossroads since 1972. So Lester, how's traffic out there this fine morning?
A couple of cars went by earlier. You know old Mrs. Joe? She was speeding. And Timmy and James, they went by in a yellow car and they were arguing. Ain't no traffic, really.
There you go, folks. Looks like nobody's getting to work on time this morning. As for you school kids, you better hurry up and eat those Wheaties because the first bell rang 15 minutes ago.
Okay, I'm going to stop on that radio. So the actor here, John Trudell, was both an actual radio host and a major spokesperson for the Indians of All Tribes group during the occupation of Alcatraz Island from 1969 to 1971. And he was chairman of the American Indian Movement from 1973 to 1979. If you're interested in his career, it's well known, but he's also the subject of Cherokee filmmaker Heather Ray's documentary film Trudell. So that's another film you can see about him. He's also a poet, and his FBI file famously describes him as very eloquent and therefore very dangerous. So in his role here as Randy Pion, the radio announcer, he is producing radio for an Indigenous audience on the reservation. This is like Indians listening to Indians on the radio, right? This is like a repeat of what we saw with young Victor and the TV. It's also DIY media with low production values, part of a communications survival strategy and an exercise of autonomy by owning the technological means of media production on the reservation. So finally, what I want to point out about what he says in this clip is that his lines assert a kind of sovereignty here by claiming that our reservation is 1, beautiful, 2, today, 3, it's a good day to be Indigenous. We hear not about poverty or blighted land or disappearing tribes, but rather about sovereignty on native land, verdancy and beauty, modernity and presence in this brief sentence. Finally, he refers at the end to his youth audience, all you school kids out there, and we see the radio made visible across the cut. We see a sender, receiver, media circuit that is all native, youth-oriented, and multi-generational. Right? That is what the film is doing, and that is also what the film is showing us. This casting politicizes the role of the radio DJ through the associations with past media coverage of AIM and suggests the film's very self-conscious presentation as a new Indigenous voice in popular culture. Significantly, this self-presentation is projected through radio, and I want to point out again that radio westerns once played a crucial role in disseminating stereotypes about Indians as Tonto sidekicks in shows like the long-running Lone Ranger series. While local radio stations on reservations or shows like Oklahoma's long-running Indians for Indians radio show have been really important early instances of Native appropriation of broadcast media. Let's see if I can play the rest of this. I think there's just another couple seconds.
Hey, Victor! Come on.
So the second scene I'll show is from Sterling Harjo's 2009 film, Barking Water, and features Yuchi Muskoki actor Richard Way Reitman and Ponca actress and native rights activist Casey Camp Horinek. Both are artists and activists. Camp Horinek in particular is a traditional drumkeeper for the Ponca Pathata Women's Scalp Dance Society and is a longtime grassroots activist on environmental and civil rights issues. This scene is a flashback in the film to an earlier moment in their relationship. In the film's larger story, Irene, her character, is driving the terminally ill Frankie from the hospital for a last visit to relatives. So here's the clip from Barking Water. This is a flashback to another time. So you can see it's in this sort of sepia tone, signaling us of the flashback.
Yeah. Yeah. Let's get some land.
Okay.
You gonna get the money?
I don't know.
Wouldn't that be something? Have our own land. My family lost most of ours.
This is our land.
Amen.
Yes. It's our land.
Strange echoes land.
But we're on it.
Because we asked him nicely.
But right now it's ours.
So in this flashback, Whitman's character, Frankie, dreams of buying land since his family lost their allotted land in what is now Oklahoma. In the context of land dispossession, of the desire to return to land by purchasing what had once been theirs already, Irene, played by Camp Horinek, replies, "This is our land. We're on it," she says. "This is our land." Her lines reframe what it means to be Indigenous on the land by reminding Frankie of their present moment. Not land lost in the past, not land to be bought in the future, but their relationship with the land as they travel on it now. You own your moment in time, she seems to say. We are in relation to the land as we are present on it. Barking Water is a road film that is also a love song to Oklahoma's Indian country, with all of its contradictions, complicated histories, and legacies of dispossession, yet also its strengths of culture and vibrancy. As they visit different communities and relatives, tap networks of trust and mistrust in the context of displacement, Camp Horinek makes vocal assertions of Indigenous sovereignty. By speaking her claim to her territories, she makes it so. Reframing the terms of mobility across Indigenous lands away from American ideas about land ownership and property to another way of being in relation. So the second framework that I want to offer you tonight is Indigenous futurisms, a way of imagining Indigenous peoples not as locked in the past, but rather as contemporary agents envisioning and determining their own futures. Related to other artistic movements like Afrofuturism, Indigenous futurism is also invested in speculative and imagined futures, whether utopic or dystopic, technologically based, or suffused with magic. Night Raiders director Dennis Goulet notes that as a genre, science fiction filmmaking, quote, liberates you as a storyteller to come at things you want to say. You can be as political as you want because you're actually in a totally fictional universe and you can say whatever you want to say. These Indigenous engagements with science fiction genres, the role of prophecy and cosmology within Indigenous traditions, represent storytelling techniques that create fluid perceptions of time, writes scholar Kristen Dowell. Anishinaabe writer Grace Dillon describes one element of Indigenous futurism as native slipstream, a style of speculative fiction that infuses stories with time travel, alternate realities and multiverses, and alternative histories. She writes that native slipstreams views time as pasts, presents, and futures that flow together like currents in a navigable stream. It thus represents nonlinear thinking about space-time. These fluidities of time, especially through appropriating mainstream film genres such as science fiction and horror, using temporal narrative structures like flashback and prophecy, bring the past and present into conversation around intergenerational trauma, resistance, and resilience. Turning back to smoke signals, which is a sort of urtext, right, for this time of Indigenous filmmaking. The images of traveling on the road also become a way of moving through time. Victor and Thomas's road trip is circular rather than linear, revising The Dead End and other road films like Easy Rider, Midnight Cowboy, Thelma and Louise, and even Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid, which all end with the protagonist's deaths and with the cessation of cinematic movement, right, often through freeze frame, for example. In contrast, Smoke Signals asks viewers to meditate not on the finality of death and vanishing, but rather on mental traveling, the process and possibilities of memory and retrieval and return. This temporal fluidity is manifested in other ways using the metaphor of the road and later the Spokane River. So the characters of Velma and Lucy have a singular backward driving style. Their car's transmission is out and only drives in reverse, forcing the driver to look backwards in order to move forwards. So significantly, the film's reference to oral traditions and storytelling comes at this moment, suggesting that the car's movement backwards parallels the film's narrative flashback structure, circling back through Thomas's stories about the past that move the narrative along. In Smoke Signals, this slippery sense of time takes the form of also a specific place, where visions and memories converge, bringing together the past and the future. Although this is a road movie, not a sci-fi movie, we can still see the bridge of the Spokane River as a point of access to native slipstream. It is literally a stream of water. This place on the river is a very old, very specific Spokane meeting place. Of course, it also symbolizes crossing over, both spiritually to an afterlife and in terms of generational transition, because this is where Victor brings his father's ashes. So the bridge where the road crosses the Spokane River is the site of Thomas's stories about Victor's dad, and it's also where Victor grieves in the closing scene of this film. This location, Spokane Falls, was a place of gathering and a traditional tribal site for harvesting salmon. Like the characters in Smoke Signals, salmon leave and then return to the place where they were born. Thousands of salmon once migrated up the Columbia River and the Spokane tributary to spawn each year and were stopped by the Spokane Falls, making this a place where many inland tribes gathered for annual harvests of fish. Of the prime fishing sites on the Spokane River, Alex Sherwood, former chairman of the Spokane Tribal Council, identified Spokane Falls as the most important, a kind of central fishing place, and a dividing line between Spokane and Coeur d'Alene tribal territories. Standing above the Spokane Falls after a meeting in 1973, Sherwood described the scene of the annual harvest. And this is a long quote. "I remember this river so well as it was before the dams. My father and grandfather used to tell me how it was before the white men came, right below where we are standing. Indians from all over the world, all over would gather every year for the annual salmon fishery. It was beautiful then, thousands coming from many miles. You could hear the shouts, the shouting welcomes as they arrived, the dancing, the singing, the trading, the games, the races, always the hearty hugs, and the fish. The fish sometimes so thick it seemed that they filled the river." The name Spokane itself, often translated as children of the sun and children of the rainbow, has also been described as, quote, derived from an old Indian word that refers to an important or great salmon fishing place. Linguist Grant Smith argues that the most accurate translation is children of the refracted light, referring to the experience of fishing in the midst of sunlit spray in the river falls. So that's sovereignty. In contrast to this meditation on the cultural meaning and beauty of the Spokane Falls with the Spokanes and Coeur d'Alene characters in Smoke Signals, two more recent films, the 2013 film Rhymes for Young Ghouls and the 2021 film Night Raiders, engages with Indigenous futurism and slipstream to address the bleak history of Indigenous residential boarding schools. I want to remark here, too, on the prominence of women characters and directors in these more recent films. Devery Jacobs starring as Isla in Rhymes for Young Ghouls, and Cree director Danis Goulet directing her first feature film with Night Raiders. The last 2 decades has seen an explosion of Indigenous media production, from documentaries to feature films to animation and digital media, screening at film festivals worldwide. Canada now has an Indigenous Screen Office. The Sundance Film Festival has a long-running Native Voices program, and now Netflix and Amazon and other platforms are focusing on developing and streaming Indigenous productions. With this new film infrastructure has come an incredible wave of productions by Indigenous women. Here's a statistic. It's a couple years old, but it's a really powerful one. Of the productions screened at the 2017 Imaginative Film Festival, 72% were made by Indigenous women directors. 72%. This remarkable proportion is the exact inverse of the notoriously dismal numbers in the mainstream film industry of independent films screened at high-profile festivals in the United States in 2016-2017. For example, 72% of those working in key behind-the-scenes roles were men. So Night Raiders, in particular, marks the ascendance of a cohort of Indigenous women directors and performers, including not only Danis Goulet, but also Elamaya Tailfeathers, who plays Niska in Night Raiders, but who has also directed several films in her own right. Lisa Jackson, Helen Haig Brown, Tasha Hubbard, Amanda Spotted Fawn Strong, Sonia Boileau, Sidney Freeland, Ramona Emerson, and many others. And many of their feature films feature tough women fighting back, accessing real trauma with fictional tools, with actors sometimes bringing lived experience to the set. They approach Indigenous traumas with sensitivity, even as the films engage what Jeff Barnaby has called bare-knuckle violence. The films for this series move around in time using flashback and prophecy and speculative futures and alternative histories to visualize generational residential school legacies that Canada and the US are just beginning to reckon with. And I'm going to put an image up on the screen that I think is somewhat overused, but I think it's important to see it and talk about it. This is a Navajo student, Tom Torlino, who was at the Carlisle Indian Industrial School in Pennsylvania from 1882. The pictures are from 1882 to 1885. And these before and after pictures were often taken and used as part of the school's fundraising efforts in Congress to continue their funding. And they're very widely circulated. This context is really essential to understanding these films. In Canada, the mandatory residential school system for Indigenous children, run by Christian churches, operated for more than 160 years, starting in the 1880s, and forcibly separated more than 150,000 children from their families and communities. This image of Navajo student Tom Torlino is from that residential school system. Originally circulated to promote the schools, as I say, this photographic sequence omits the trauma that occurred between the before and the after, right? That story does not get told, right? It gets something happened, but we do not see or hear what happened, right? It is a missing story in this photographic sequence, a suppressed story. The goal of the schools was to strip Indigenous people of their culture and connections, assimilating them into US or Canadian settler society, and the conditions in the schools were notoriously abusive and often horrific. The last federal Indian residential school in Canada closed in 1996, and in the summer of 2019, as many of you may know, an Indigenous community in British Columbia proved that their people's stories about the schools were true. They found a mass grave containing the remains of 215 children, as young as 3, on the grounds of a residential school. As other communities began to use new radar technologies to search residential school grounds, they continue to find such mass grave sites, and the number to date is in the thousands. Canada's Truth and Reconciliation Commission has established that over 4,000 children died at the schools, and their families were sometimes never notified. This system mimicked a similar one in the US, and both countries, even after the schools were closed, often use the adoption and foster care systems to continue to remove Indigenous children from their families at staggeringly high rates. And so what I want to point out is that this is ongoing in other systems. So in 1978, just before the passing of the Indian Child Welfare Act in the US, studies revealed that a large number of Native children were being separated from their parents and their extended families and communities by state child welfare and private adoption agencies. As many as 25 to 35% of all Native children in the US were being removed from their families. And of those removed, 85% were placed outside their families and communities, even when fit and willing relatives were available to take them. So in addition to intergenerational trauma, these kinds of statistics represent an existential threat to the future of Indigenous nations. Contemporary filmmakers are using genres such as horror and sci-fi to process the trauma of boarding schools, and within those genres using flashback and prophecy structures. So Rhymes for Young Ghouls is set, I mean, in some ways the most powerful film of this series, I think, according to a lot of viewers. This film is set on a bleak fictional reserve in Canada and tells the story of Isla, a girl trying to avoid being sent to the boarding school, St. Dymphna's. Set in the past was an early scene in 1969 and then the remainder of the film taking place in 1976. Visually, the film alludes to horror, the fantastic, and even steampunk through images of gas masks and its comic art style. Yet, memories of the school haunt the reserve. At the center of the film is an animated story told by a beloved elder, narrating residential school experiences in an anti-creation story that is a dystopic allegory of colonists devouring Indigenous peoples. In another scene, Ayla has been brought to the school and her hair is cut, a form of violence that recurs in almost every film about the residential school experience. So I'm going to show this clip of Ayla as her hair is cut and she's bathed, and her relative is also held hostage at the school.
Misbegotten children here.
Tossed into the fire and burned.
We thought Ayla was down, another transgression set for the flame. Then you stepped up and took responsibility. Here we are, all of us, damned.
I find these clips hard to watch sometimes. After this sequence, Isla is isolated in a dark room where she has a vision of encountering a mass grave. And when she is rescued by a young student from the school, we see images of ghosts on the wall as she leaves. So I'm not going to show you the vision of the mass grave, but this is the scene as she's leaving this cell. We can understand these sequences as one example from the stories that were suppressed by the before and after pictures, right? These are the stories that are not told in those pictures that omit the trauma of attending the schools and the trauma of what happened to people there. The film makes extensive use of masks to allude to the generational shared trauma of boarding schools and their after effects as members of the community turn to drugs and alcohol to, as Isla says, cultivate the art of forgetfulness. And I just want to show you the film makes really extensive use of masks, which are protection for her and also culturally and ceremonially prominent in Abenaki, Mi'kmaq, and other Eastern Indigenous nations. So you can see the gas mask that she wears that her mother also wears, and then she wears a mask of an old woman and it allies her with an older woman mentor and sort of adopted grandmother in the film. So extensive use of masks. These films are sharing those suppressed stories of forced transformation, which circulated in Indigenous communities for decades, but were ignored by Canadian and US officials. In addition to recurring images of haircutting and other assaults on Indigenous children's bodies, other recurring images of boarding schools and Indigenous films include military drills and images of institutional life, such as rows of bunks. We see these images over and over and over again, even in films as early as 1929. The film Redskin from Paramount showed an Indigenous experience at boarding school with these kinds of images. In the 2021 film Night Raiders, a dystopic future features a totalitarian state seizing children to re-educate them and transfer their political citizenship, using them as soldiers. Their slogan is "One country, one language, one flag." So there's erasure of Indigenous distinctiveness. All the children are considered to be the official property of the state, summoning clear parallels to the seizure of children from boarding school education or through the foster care system. Yet Night Raiders encourages us to imagine otherwise, using science fiction not only to access history, but also to envision Indigenous futures. In both Night Raiders and Rhymes for Young Ghouls, women lead Indigenous raids of these institutional structures of child theft in order to rescue stolen children and seek restitution or revenge from deep wounds and abuses of power. Night Raiders goes even farther. Acting on a prophecy that a guardian will arrive to lead them to freedom, a group of Cree resistors, whose camp, by the way, resembles very strongly the prayer camps at Standing Rock, take in a mother, Niska, whose daughter, Wasis, has been taken to the schools and renamed Elizabeth. Rescuing Wasis, they discover her special powers to control the AI drones deployed by the state. This Indigenous ability to communicate with artificial intelligence, to understand the living nature even of machines, represents an ethic of connection and new kinship with the other than human world, based in the language, because Wasis speaks to the drones in Cree. Cree actor Gail Maurice, who plays Ida, the leader of the Indigenous resistance, speaks fluent Cree throughout the film. Rather than representing a language of the past, Cree becomes, in Night Raiders, a language of the future. Goulet teaches viewers to anticipate that the Cree language will survive and thrive, becoming the language of resistance and freedom in 2043. As Wasis speaks Cree to birds and AI drones alike, she models Indigenous people as stewards of technology as well as nature. Language revitalization and Indigenous traditions of prophecy converge in a narrative structure that becomes the point of articulation with science fiction and the speculative imaginaries of native slipstream and Indigenous futurity. And in the face of a callous state system that has historically trafficked Indigenous children and presumed Indigenous decline, Night Raiders is premised on valuing children as the Indigenous future. Director Dennis Goulet reminds us, quote, we're on the precipice of a golden age of Indigenous cinema. These stories are just starting to get these massive platforms like our film is, and there's so many stories to be told. For many communities, the social relations of production are as important as what ends up on screen. In addition to professional film producers, Indigenous communities are making media for cultural and language revitalization and to translate traditional knowledge to new media platforms and even immersive virtual reality environments and video games. Films and popular culture, genre films like the road film, horror, and science fiction can be a lingua franca of shared stories and shared images. As we dismantle centuries of stereotypes, cinema by Indigenous peoples for Indigenous peoples can also give the public new narratives. So if you were moved by the films in this series, I'm here to tell you there's a lot more out there. So a lot of, as Dennis Goulet says, a lot of it streams from major platforms like Netflix. Some of it streams for free from libraries like this one. What's the best way to support the new wave of Indigenous filmmaking? It is with our attention. So the next 10 years of Indigenous filmmaking are going to be amazing. Netflix is recruiting Indigenous animators for new shows. Apache producer Bird Running Water just signed on to produce films for Amazon. The Sundance Film Festival's Native American Films program is running strong. Creek filmmaker Joanna Hearne and Maori filmmaker Taika Waititi have multiple projects in the works. So if you liked Rumble, check out Joanna Hearne's documentary, Love and Fury, about the careers of contemporary Indigenous artists and musicians, or his film, This May Be the Last Time, about Muskogee Creek language hymns. If you love Rhymes for Young Ghouls, check out Jeff Barnaby's newest film, a gory, hardcore zombie film called Blood Quantum. It is gory and it is hardcore. Or his intensely creepy short film, File Under Miscellaneous, which is a very short film and streams for free and is very, very creepy. If you loved Barking Water, Joanna Hearne has another understated Oklahoma drama, a coming-of-age story about leaving home called Four Sheets to the Wind, starring Cody Lightning, who played the young Victor Joseph in Smoke Signals. Now he's all grown up. You might also love Rustic Oracle by Sonia Boileau, who takes on the epidemic of violence against Indigenous women and girls in a profoundly nuanced and gentle way from a younger sister's perspective. If you loved Ella Maya Tailfeather's performance in Night Raiders, check out her own feature film, The Body Remembers When the World Broke Open, which is just extraordinary, as well as her new documentary, The Meaning of Empathy. Have you seen the new television comedies, Rutherford Falls and Reservation Dogs? From Australia, you can stream films like 10 Canoes, the television series Clever Man, which is amazing, and the almost wordless drama, Samson and Delilah, or the romantic comedy with lots of words, Top End Wedding. Have you seen Maori actor and director and producer Taika Waititi's films such as Boy and Hunt for the Wilder People? After his Oscar win for Best Script Adaptation for the film Jojo Rabbit, Waititi gave a land acknowledgement and a brief speech of thanks that's worth repeating here in closing. While gesturing to ancient and ongoing Indigenous presence on the land, still there despite centuries of erasure, Waititi also insists on Indigenous futurity and its great promise. To all the Indigenous kids in the world who want to do art and dance and write stories, he said, "We are the original storytellers, and we can make it here as well." Thanks.
Thank you so much, Dr. Hearne. Although we are a intimate group tonight, because we also have online viewers, please, if you have a question, come up to the microphone to ask it so everyone may hear. One of my first questions, just based on the other films you just shared, how do you distinguish, or are there notable differences between Indigenous films that we see coming out of New Zealand or other countries versus those coming from North America in terms of style or narrative or what they're looking to accomplish?
That is a great question. I don't know that I have sweeping assertions of different kinds of films coming from different kind of colonial nation states and the Indigenous peoples within those nation states, but there are circumstances that are different, and some of those differences come from the institutional structures and funding structures. So I wouldn't say that those are differences that are necessarily coming from different communities, although that might also be true. So there are some portmanteau films or sort of composite films with many short stories that are related coming together in a kind of circular narrative that are coming out of Aotearoa, New Zealand, including Waru, and another one called Vai. And they're really interesting because they're both narrative and have this flow, but they're also really experimental in the way that they're bringing together many short stories. And then Taika Waititi has had an enormous influence on how we think about Indigenous films coming from Aotearoa, and so his sense of comedy has really marked films like Boy and Hunt for the Wilder People, but also he makes films that are not easily necessarily identifiable as Indigenous films, like his vampire comedy mockumentary right? And other films like that, so that kind of playfulness. And then out of Canada, there's been very consistent funding. And so there's a real surge coming out of Canada. And one of the things that's happening there is that there's a lot of VR and futuristic and really kind of cutting edge technological work coming out of Canada. And in US, the funding structures are not as strong and not as generous. And so there's less work coming out and more of it is short films or feature length. So that's the sort of short answer.
Excellent. Well, and I also wonder too, I mean, you talked about Indigenous futurism and, I mean, obviously with the existing sort of portrayals in popular media and just what we learn in our typical history classes, there's so much to correct in terms of history. And I think about the boarding school films and even Reservation Dogs, there's a lot of education that those filmmakers are doing. So can you talk about, as we move into hopefully this golden age, like what do you think the balance might look like between some of the futurism and then correcting history, or is it one and the same?
I think there is always that awareness that in speaking to this broader public, Indigenous filmmakers are also always doing some teaching. Yeah, and so it's interesting because the science fiction about residential schools, for example, or the Gothic and the horror films about residential schools, those are testimony, even though they're fiction films. They're also testimony. So they are talking about miseducation, and they are also doing education. They are also teaching, right? They are also doing pedagogy with audiences. But also affirming for Indigenous communities what they already knew because of those stories circulating all the time. So there is teaching happening all the time. But it's interesting to think about this in terms of a visual model or a place-based model. Maori filmmaker Barry Barclay, who's sadly passed on now, but was an important filmmaker for many, many years, talked about Maori filmmaking in terms of the Maori marae. And the marae is a kind of ceremonial ground that is attached to a particular Maori group. And it's a protected, bounded ceremonial place with a structure on it. And it is a place where Maori have ceremonies and gatherings and teaching people, but also it is a Maori place with Maori rules. It is also a place where they host outsiders. So you can be invited in, but you have to follow the Maori rules, right? Because it's a Maori place. And he suggested in an essay about thinking about Indigenous film as a communications marae. It is a place where Indigenous filmmakers speak to their own communities using their own rules and their own codes of communication. But you can invite other people to come and visit, but they have to work by your rules, your communication. And so he was thinking about, like, when are you talking into your community and when are you talking out to the world? And that the most effective films, he said, are the ones where you're talking into the community. It's a communications marae. It is for the community, but other people can also come and join and watch in a respectful way according to the rules of the marae. So we can think about it in that way that Barry Barclay invited us to, as media that is, in fact, aware that visitors might be present, but that is not what the marae is for exclusively, right? It is for the community.
Oh, I think we have a question here.
I'm here for awareness because I grew up in the 50s and 60s, and the images that I have is from television. It's all negative of Indigenous people. It's the Lone Ranger. It's all negative. And the movies I've not seen, and you mentioned that they're streaming, the new movies I've not seen any of them. They're streaming on Netflix and Hulu. Now, I am ancient, so I'm doing cable. Is there any cable TV, regular cable, any of these movies?
That's a great question. I don't know the answer to what streams where and what is available on cable. However, the Kansas City Public Libraries are streaming some of these films, right?
Yes, so I would say on the event listing or description for this event, we shared a list of films we have available for checkout, as well as others. Most of them are streaming on Canopy, so that's a streaming service that you get free to access with your library card. So many of those films are available there, but things are also available to check out on DVD.
Yeah, and most are available on DVD also. So I think Night Raiders is so new that it's not yet out on DVD. There's also an enormous body of short films, and those often stream for free. And the National Film Board of Canada, which is a long-standing national screen office that's been going since the 50s. The United States doesn't have a national screen office, but Canada does, the National Film Board of Canada, NFB. They, a few years ago, made most of their content free to stream. I mean, decades and decades and decades of content, documentaries, feature films. So they have a whole section of Indigenous listings, and you can just go to the NFB website and stream short films, documentaries, films by Alanisa Bomsuin, who's an Abenaki activist, documentary filmmaker, just extraordinary stuff. And even some of these filmmakers have their first short films were made through the NFB. So that's another site. You know, there are sites like that where you can go and just stream content for free just as you arrive there.
So as maybe a final question to wrap up, Missouri lost you to Oklahoma for teaching and your scholarship, and I'm just curious, I mean, I think about Reservation Dogs and Killers of the Flower Moon, which the film adaptation, you know, takes place in Oklahoma. How has being in Oklahoma impacted your scholarship?
So that's a great question, and one of the things is that my scholarship makes a lot of sense in that place, and especially a project I'm about to try to wrap up, and have been researching for a long time. I showed you just a few slides of it earlier, which is the story of these three Indigenous brothers, Chickasaw brothers, who were from the Chickasaw Nation. They were born in Oklahoma, or one was born in Gainesville, Texas, but they were from what was then Indian Territory. And then eventually they all ended up in Los Angeles writing, producing, directing movies. The youngest brother was still making television westerns in the mid-1950s. So those records are in Oklahoma City, a lot of those records, and the Chickasaw Nation is there as well. So it feels like the right place to be doing that work.
Absolutely. Well, and our poet laureate, who our big read is all around her book, An American Sunrise, is in Oklahoma. So it's really been a treat to have you here with us tonight. Please, if you haven't taken part in any of our other big read programs or picked up a free copy of the book, go to kclibrary.org/bigread, and you can find out more about our big read with Joy Harjo and An American Sunrise. And this Saturday, we're screening Rumble at the Plaza Library at 1 o'clock, so don't miss that documentary, Rumble, Indians Who Rock the World, Link Ray, so many, Jimi Hendrix, so many fabulous musicians that you will recognize the music right when you hear it and hearing their incredible stories. But please join me in thanking Dr. Joanna Hearne.
Thank you. Thanks so much.